Have you ever wondered what the story is for the tutorial boss of Blasphemous 2? There's no text about the Faceless One, Chisel of Oblivion within the game, no item description or dialogue to flesh out the identity of this character. Like Montañez in his unsculpted slab at the start of Blasphemous 2, we stand before the unformed enigma of the Faceless One's story. Also like Montañez in his slab, we just need the right tools to reveal the story beneath the surface. While we don't have text to read the Faceless One's story, there is his visual design and the sculpture that inspired it. And there's also early concept art that suggests a facet of his design that is obscured in later iterations. With these tools, we can chip away at the mystery surrounding this boss. Let's get into the story of the Faceless One, Chisel of Oblivion. According to the Blasphemous 2 art book, the Chisel of Oblivion's armor is inspired by English sculptor Alfred Gilbert's figure of St. George, created in 1896. Comparing the designs, we see that the armor of Gilbert's St. George figure is pretty directly replicated for the Chisel of Oblivion. But besides looking awesome, what's the significance of this armor? To answer that, let's look at the context in which the St. George figure was created. Prince Albert Victor, second in line to the throne of England, tragically died at just 28 from the flu in 1892. The English royal family commissioned renowned sculptor Alfred Gilbert to create Prince Albert Victor's tomb, and the St. George figure was one of 12 figures designed to adorn the grille of the tomb. We'll talk about the legend of the historical St. George more shortly, but for now it's worth noting that he's the patron saint of England and a symbol of protection and sacrifice. His presence on Prince Albert Victor's tomb is both as the patron saint of England and to represent the ideals that the royal family saw embodied in the young prince who would have someday been king. Within this context, I think it's no coincidence that this armor was chosen for a boss who we find just outside of the repose of the Silent One, the tomb of Penitente. Like the St. George sculpture that stands at Prince Albert Victor's tomb, the Chisel of Oblivion stands at Penitente's tomb. This parallel could be the extent of the inspiration combined with a healthy dose of the armor looking cool, but I think there's more to it. While the Blasphemous series doesn't exclusively reference Spanish art and history, it usually steps outside of Andalusia for a particular reason. So let's take it one step further and explore the legend of St. George and how it might relate to the Faceless One, Chisel of Oblivion. The historical St. George was a Christian man born in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, in the 3rd century. He was a soldier in the Roman army and eventually became a member of Emperor Diocletian's Praetorian Guard. Unfortunately for him, the Roman emperors of the time were not fond of Christians, and he was executed as part of the Diocletian persecution in 330 CE. However, the death of St. George the man was only the beginning of the legend of St. George. Roughly 200 years later, in the 5th century, he became venerated as a martyr and saint by the Catholic Church. And then about 700 years after that, St. George became a legend to Christians during the Crusades as a heroic crusader knight who saved a village from a dragon. I'm not here to explain how that happened, I'm just telling you that it did. The tale of St. George and the dragon became iconic to Western Christians, so much so that England made him their patron saint. England made St. George's Cross, the red cross on white, as their banner in the late Middle Ages to symbolize courage, sacrifice, purity, and peace. And that's how an Anatolian martyr of the Roman Empire became an icon of English chivalry. But how does this icon of English chivalry tie into the tutorial boss of the Spanish video game Blasphemous 2? I don't think there's anything to tie them together, at least not directly. We have no text or dialogue in the game about the Chisel of Oblivion that suggests who he was prior to Blasphemous 2. All of the information we have about him is his design and the boss fight. And I'd like to suggest that this is because the Faceless One, Chisel of Oblivion, may be a representation of the legend of Penitente. St. George is revered as a martyr of the Catholic Church, and likewise Penitente is revered as a martyr of the Custodian Church, at least at the time of his entombment, as we can see by the mourning statues adorning his tomb. This theory that the Chisel of Oblivion is a representation of Penitente, akin to how the figure of St. George is a representation of the legend of St. George, is reinforced by the primary deviation between the design of the Chisel of Oblivion and the figure of St. George: the head. The St. George figure has an open-faced helm, while the Faceless One has a cloth obscuring his head. Penitente has no voice, his face is not seen, and his name is not known. It was the mystery of these details, Penitente's hidden visage, that led Escobar to massacre the entirety of the Brotherhood of Silent Sorrow in Blasphemous One to try and escape the visions of one bearing their helm defeating him. So it would make sense for a representation of Penitente to not have a face and even to be called the Faceless One. However, if the Faceless One is a representation of Penitente, why do they look so different? Why is he wielding a wheel and not a representation of mea culpa? My explanation for this is where things really come together thematically for me, and I see this reference as more than just a cool visual nod. Chisel of Oblivion as a representation of Penitente looks visually distinct from Penitente simply because time has passed and it's a more modern interpretation of his look. The more modern armor style is an early indication to the player that time in Custodia has progressed, something that is more bluntly underlined by the achievement for beating the Chisel of Oblivion, titled 1,000 Years Later. This is then reinforced when the player discovers the ruins of the Mother of Mothers Church deep beneath the City of the Blessed Name. And we see this in the story of Blasphemous 2 in a Custodia where the Twisted One, the icon of the church in Blasphemous 1, is largely forgotten. Hell, even the miracle was mostly forgotten until this couple prayed to it for a child. All of this is to say that the passage of time and the obfuscation of the past is a theme in Blasphemous 2. The way in which this concept ties back into the figure of St. George is that the figure of St. George doesn't even look like him. And this figure is recognized as a turning point from Victorian art to Art Nouveau style sculpture in England. As we discussed earlier, the real St. George was a Praetorian guard in the Roman Empire, not a Crusader knight in fluted armor standing atop a defeated dragon, as he was depicted 1500 years later by Gilbert. And while the depiction of St. George as a crusading knight has been around for about 700 years at that point, the features and proportions of this figure is emblematic of the shift from the Victorian style prevalent in the earlier 1800s to the Art Nouveau style that would become popular starting in the 1890s. In fact, the legacy of the St. George statue historically is how it's emblematic of the greater shift in art styles at this time. So now that I've laid all of this out, let's bring all the connections between the St. George figure and Blasphemous 2 together. We have the parallel of the figure in the Chisel of Oblivion being located at a tomb. We have the similarities in the mythology and perception between Penitente and St. George. And then we have the historical context of the St. George figure as emblematic of a shift towards a more modern art style, and the focus on the passage of time between Blasphemous 1 and 2. Bring all of that together, and I think it makes for a compelling case that the Faceless One, Chisel of Oblivion, is meant to be a modern representation of Penitente within the world of the game. At the very least, I think these parallels speak to the intentionality and consideration involved in what inspirations the game kitchen pulls from and why. Now that we've had our art history lesson for the video, we have a few loose ends that need to be addressed. Namely, am I suggesting that the Faceless One, Chisel of Oblivion, is a living statue? Blasphemous 2 does feature living statues and tombs, however they're still made of stone, and the Chisel of Oblivion is seen to be flesh and blood. But within the cut content of Blasphemous 2, we see a few sculpted enemies that appear to become flesh and blood, seemingly through the machinations of the miracle. I'd normally discount these enemies as being something separate, but the inspiration for the Faceless One being a statue in the title Chisel of Oblivion, connecting the boss with the theme of sculpture, makes me wonder if he wasn't also designed with this concept in mind. And in fact, we see concept art for the Chisel of Oblivion not seen elsewhere in episode 5 of the Blasphemous 2 Dev Diaries that has the boss with cracked and stony skin. This tells us two things. At some point in development, he was intended to be made of stone, likely a living statue, and also that because this concept art wasn't featured in the art book or anywhere else, these were early designs that changed or at least became less obvious in the final design. As the concept art we do have for the Chisel of Oblivion seems to have normal flesh and not the cracked and stony skin featured in the earlier design iterations. Ultimately, I think it's something that's left ambiguous and up to interpretation. I'd prefer a bit of in-game text to flesh him out, but I do think that the Faceless One as a sculpture brought to life by the miracle does simplify his motivations in a way that doesn't demand much supporting text. It's easier to understand the miracle bringing the Faceless One to life to hinder Penitente from setting out on his pilgrimage to slay the incarnate devotion. And you have the added bonus of there being some twisted irony in a statue representing Penitente fighting him, which is in line with how the miracle twists with its acts. On the other hand, if the Faceless One is a flesh and blood person wearing a representation of Penitente, He wouldn't be expecting anyone to be coming out of the tomb and might view it as something profaning the sacred. It's not like Penitente is going to say anything to clear up confusion, and as we've already discussed, the real Penitente and his appearance may not even be compatible with the modern myth of the Silent One. We witness characters like Asterion not recognizing Penitente by his armor, and we don't get indication from modern custodians during the game that they know who he is. Ultimately, the lack of text leaves us without definitive answers, so I don't think we can say anything with confidence. Being a flesh and blood person is sort of the default in Blasphemous and Life, and arguing that it doesn't say he wasn't a sculpture is asinine, but I personally like the theory of him being a sculpture come to life for how it ties into the inspirations discussed within this video. But I'm biased when it comes to hoping that sculptures can come to life, because if that can happen, then we might be able to bring my boy Deo Gracias back. And there you have it, the inspirations for the Faceless One, Chisel of Oblivion, and what it tells us about the world and the character. This video is originally pretty short and sweet in my head. After all, he doesn't have in-game text to dig into. But as with my video on Sor Cautiva, when I dig into these bosses with little to no in-game text, I'm reminded of the depth of the designs in the Blasphemous games and how much art and history inspires them. And it's always a joy to dig into those aspects and bring these thoughtful inspirations of the visual design to the forefront. So what do you think about the design of the Faceless One, and how do you feel about these characters whose stories live mostly through their visual design? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. I've got a blasphemous amount of content on here exploring the series in all sorts of ways, from the game design to the inspirations behind the world of Blasphemous. And I cover lots of other Metroidvania and Souls-like games on the channel, so check those out if you're a fan of those genres. As always, thanks for your support, thank the miracle for the physics of the breaking wheel, and thanks for watching.